Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning into this webinar. This webinar is focused on the variety of documents that are required to govern an organization. Over the next hour or so, little less, little more, we are going to focus on our discussion on 4 areas. We will start with the documents that pertain to governance. Then we will move into discussing documents that relate to operations. We will discuss the documents that are used in reporting, and then we will finish talking about a critical function of a board, which is risk management, and how that relates back to an organization's documents. As Gabriel mentioned, my name is Lara Schroeder. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm based in Saskatoon, which is located on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. My academic and professional background is in sport management. I have a diploma, bachelor's, and master's degree in sport, recreation, tourism, and leisure studies altogether. My previous professional experience includes roles with 3 different provincial sport organizations, including Saskatchewan Soccer, as well as I've held multiple volunteer roles at different multi-sport games. I now own Spark Solutions, a consulting and facilitation firm that supports local, provincial, and regional and national sport and recreation organizations to achieve their organizational goals in governance, strategy, and programming. I'm also a trained volleyball coach as well as volleyball official. You can see me here with one of Saskatchewan's best volleyball exports, Gavin Schmitz. That is true to size, apparently. And I've enjoyed sport from almost every role sport has to offer. Let's start our conversation by talking about the various documents that pertain to governance. It's important that some of the things I'm noting today pertain more to nonprofit organizations than for-profit organizations. For-profit organizations will have similar requirements, but I won't be touching on these throughout the webinar. That being said, many of the documents I do speak to today will pertain both to nonprofits and for-profit organizations, so there's good applicability here for everyone. So let's start with the Articles of Incorporation. The Articles are also referred to as a constitution, which particularly if you are in British Columbia, as you are, your government refers to that to articles as constitutions in the Societies Act. Articles of Incorporation are a legal document that confirms registration of the corporation with the government. Once filed, the articles are valid in perpetuity. Legislation dictates what must be in articles of a corporation. It must include such things as the name of the organization and where the organization is located. The articles must include the classes of membership, their rights, privileges, restrictions, and conditions. At least one category of membership must have voting rights. It should state the type of organization it is, such as if it's a membership organization or if it's a charitable organization. It should also outline any restrictions on business, as in what it won't do. It must also include where property and resources would go or be allocated to if an organization were to dissolve. So that is a key element there. And I was part of a nonprofit organization that did dissolve and worked through the dissolution process. And the government did follow up with me to ensure that the resources did go where our bylaws said that they would. So the articles can also include anything else that you would put in the bylaws, but I would suggest you keep only what's required in the bylaws. And this is because the articles are the gospel, so to speak. Everything must match the articles, and in cases of discrepancy, whatever is said in the articles is what organizations must go by. Articles are approved by a 2/3 majority of your membership present at the AGM or the special general meeting, and the vote must occur only at meetings where members have been given notice that this vote will occur. It's for this reason that I would recommend that anything that goes in the bylaws and is not required according to the Act should be left in the bylaws. If you have to make an amendment, receiving 2/3 majority could be challenging. Amendments can be made to the articles, and these are called articles of amendment. They would be kept with the original documents, but you would not update the document to combine everything together like you would with bylaws. Next, we're talking about bylaws. The bylaws are the main governing document of a nonprofit organization. As I mentioned before, the bylaws must align with the articles or the Constitution, and then all policies and operations must align with the bylaws. The bylaws provide a basic framework of the basic procedural rules for the organization. Generally speaking, they contain the conditions of membership, such as how to apply for membership, what dues must be paid, or what constitutes good and bad standing, and that members may be disciplined and placed in bad standing. The bylaws will discuss details around the meeting of members, such as annual general meetings or special general meetings. The document will detail the number of directors that will lead the organization, how they're elected, how vacancies may be filled, if there are any specific positions, such as a president, a vice president, secretary, or treasurer, which are also known as officers. It might also discuss how and when notice is given, but this is generally laid out in the Societies Act and could be left out. Verbiage on how disputes may be resolved or will be resolved may also be included. Organizations may sometimes also include their mission or vision statement or the values of the organization. That wouldn't be something I recommend, as these statements are not necessarily static statements that never change. They would live more appropriately in the strategic plan, which we'll discuss next. Most bylaws, most parts of the bylaws are approved by a majority of members at a meeting where due notice is given, although sometimes, such as amendments to the bylaws, require 2/3 majority. The government of British Columbia offers a quality bylaws template. If you're personalizing it to your organization's needs, you must ensure that everything is consistent to the practices you actually want to have in your organization. And I'm sure BC Soccer could also help you with that. It's important to note that when preparing amendments to the Articles of Incorporation and the bylaws, you should ensure due diligence by ensuring that you refer to the relevant legislation, either the BC Societies Act, and if you're incorporated federally, also the Canada the Canada Not-for-Profit Act, to ensure that your amendments meet the legislative requirements. I have occasionally seen bylaws that contravene the provincial legislation. That's not a good place to be, and that needs to be rectified as soon as possible. These acts stipulate that the organization must keep an adequate set of records on file. This includes the articles, the bylaws with all amendments, the minutes of meetings of members for both AGMs and special general meetings, and all resolutions that occur at those meetings, and also the register of all members who are entitled to vote at those meetings. This also includes copies of documents sent to the government, including the notice of directors and any annual returns and any financial records. It is also important to note that any member of the organization is entitled to access these paper copies of these records for free at their request. That is a requirement of the legislation. So historical filing of these items should be kept. And not to mention, beyond that, if ever there's a transition in board, an entire turnover of the board, this documentation would be essential to have or have passed along, so that you're not up the creek without a paddle. That can be extremely difficult. So a strategic plan is exactly a strategic document developed by the board that communicates the strategic priorities that it's pursuing, the outcomes that the organization is striving for, and the initiatives that it is executing to get there. A strategic plan is a mid-length document, as in it covers a set number of years into the future. Often in sport, organizations choose 4 years as the length of their strategic plan to align with the quadrennial planning process that aligns with the Olympic and Paralympic Games. But 3 years, 5 years, even up to 8 years are also common. The strategic plan communicates to your community, your membership, your partners, sponsors, stakeholders, the priorities of your club. It can be a tool that helps you separate yourself from your competitors. For that reason, I'd recommend that you include your strategic plan on your website and also refer to it regularly. Some have the opinion that strategic plans are a waste of time. You go through a robust process to develop the plan and design the documents, and then often it can sit on the shelf collecting dust, never referred to again. Others believe that strategic plans are unresponsive and are written in stone and therefore are unhelpful, especially in times like today. I'm of the opinion that in sport, like in life, we get caught up in the day-to-day management of the organization and can lose sight on the long term. Discussing and then writing down the organization's long-term priorities can be a helpful reference to orient yourself to the organization's mission and drive the strategic efforts of the club. And I would also say in the past year and a half, I've worked with more than a dozen organizations to update their strategic plans or develop new ones. So I think there is a counterpoint as well to this being a time where they couldn't be helpful. I think it helps to anchor us in the direction we want to go. Next are the executive limitations. So these are a set of policies that outline the limitations placed on senior management, namely the executive director. While the board is ultimately responsible for everything about the organization, the executive director is the one who gets the job done on the ground. Therefore, the executive limitations are written in the negative so that it gives the executive director as much authority as possible to determine the best way to do the job so that it benefits the board and the organization. The limitations they set the boundaries. The board allows the CEO or the executive director to use any means as long as they fall within a reasonable limitation of the board's limiting policies. The executive limitations would generally include language around business and financial planning and conditions, asset protection, treatment of staff, contractors, and volunteers, compensation and benefits of staff, treatment of members and stakeholders, emergency succession, again, important, public image, reporting, information management, and the communication and support to the board. Whereas the executive limitations outline how the board, the executive director will operate, the governance policy or policies outline how the board will do its business. The governance policy will detail how the governance process operates, what the governance structure is, how it operates, and how it works with others, how the board monitors and reviews the governing documents and policies, such as the strategic plan, the executive limitations, and the governance policy. The governance policy will also detail how the board evaluates itself, its processes, and its relationships. This may look like one policy with a bunch of sections, or it could be a manual where each topic is a standalone policy. I've seen both. Okay, this is the very unsexy part of, of documents. Many organizations have policies and may have a governance policy and ELs or executive limitations that it uses. But I often hear of organizations who haven't reviewed or updated their policies in 5, 10, 15, even 20 years. Boards should regularly monitor and review their policies to ensure that what is included is relevant. Monitoring is the process of determining whether the policy has been executed as it is written and determining whether the board is compliant with the policy as it's written. An example of monitoring is that for the board that I sit on, The governance committee conducts the process so that each policy is monitored each year. We read the policy and then use a template chart to write whether or not we're compliant, what our successes were in meeting that compliance, or where we fell short. From there, we can use that information to inform the review. Reviewing, on the other hand, is the process of determining whether the policy is current as it's written, or if the policy requires updates to the language. Does the policy accurately reflect the processes that you use? And I would suggest if the policy has not been reviewed in 10 or 20 years, that's probably a no. An example of this is that the board I sit on chose to change all of the gendered language in our policies. So for instance, references to he or she, there's several places where he or she will blah. We've changed that to they. To expand our acknowledgement of individuals with other gender expressions than male or female. Monitoring and review is often an area that's overlooked, and I know it's because it's daunting. Where do you start? How do you do it? It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of brain power, and it takes a lot of coordination, but it is an important part of the governance process, and it should be done. Okay, we've discussed governance documents. We've made our way through that. Now let's discuss the documents that are operational in nature. Almost every organization that I've encountered has a policy and procedure manual. Policies and procedures are collectively agreed upon positions on a certain matter. Policies are the actions an organization should or should not take, and procedures are how those actions should be taken. As an example, a policy may be that refunds are issued in certain cases. The procedure would then dictate how those refunds would be issued. Then staff or volunteers have clarity about when and how to issue refunds. Policies and procedures direct staff and volunteers on how decisions should be made. And this ensures that the organization is fair and consistent in its delivery. Now, the Canada Soccer's Guide to Management Operations for the Club Licensing Program states that policies do not have to be drafted by the Board of Directors, but should be approved by the board as the chief steward of the club. I'm going to be honest, I don't share Canada Soccer's opinion here, as I'm considering these policies and procedures that we're discussing to be operational in nature, which means they're the responsibility of the staff and ultimately the senior management, which is the executive director. I don't mean to contravene Canada Soccer's direction here, but I share this to make the point that there's different schools of thought about who ultimately approves your policy manual. Regardless, your board should be aware of the policies, procedures, and practices that your staff and volunteers follow so that you can ensure from top to bottom in your organization, your messaging and intent of how you intend to operate is consistent. As well, I'd like to highlight that policies don't have to be complex, but they should exist and they should be made public on your website. This helps to ensure transparency and clarity and hopefully prevents members from accusing the organization of favoritism or conflicts of interest. Sport organizations such as yourselves will cover a myriad of topics, including technical, financial, administrative, board, and human resources policies. This graph is from Canada Soccer's Guide to Management Operations resource from the Club Licensing Program, which details the more likely policies of your organization. So you can see a variety here. We're going to touch on some of these further. Earlier, we discussed the strategic plan as the document that details the strategic direction of the board and the organization. That then is supported by an operational plan. It's the year-to-year plan that executes the strategic plan. It's generally an annual document written in advance of the given year so that it can be approved by the board, and it coincides with the annual budget. If the organization has more than the executive director for staff, then staff work plans would also, they'd be separate documents likely, but they would roll up into one comprehensive operational plan. An operational plan allows you to break the strategic plan down into manageable chunks so you can plot out how you're going to achieve your expected outcomes, as well as manage your ongoing work to keep the lights of the organization on. Especially if you are getting to year 3 or into year 4 of your strat plan, and you take a look at it and you're like, haven't actually started that, and that probably needed 2 years of work. This helps to mitigate situations like that. This graphic, also from that manual for Canada Soccer's Manual for Governance and Operations, outlines what they feel you should consider in developing your operational plan. Okay, next is a technical development plan. A technical development plan outlines the pathway through which players are developed in their prescribed programs. This document would be developed and managed by the organization's technical director and would align with both coach and volunteer development plans as well. This is an ongoing document and would detail the strategic goals of your technical programs, as well as the guiding principles of your program. It would also articulate your organization's pathway to develop players, your soccer programs, the competitions that athletes would participate in, among other things. And then this document can be used as another tool, like your strategic plan, to distinguish your organization from your competitors or your neighbors or other sports by developing technical strategies that make you unique. And you can use those then to promote yourself. A marketing and communications plan is a defined written strategy that defines the marketing focus and explains how resources will be utilized to market and spread awareness about your organization. A marketing and communication strategy would generally include marketing analysis and segmentation. This would describe the needs and wants of the current customers you serve. It would include program and product marketing, which is a clear description of each of the products and programs the organization offers, so that you then are able to promote them appropriately. It would include marketing and communication channel identification, so the methods with which you use to market yourself: website, social media, TV, radio. In Saskatoon, I often see signs on the boulevard, different things such as that, and how you would use those strategies. Finally, the marketing and communications plan would include structured customer satisfaction research and analysis, such as data from evaluations that you do about your programming to know if your marketing and communications plan is effective. Like I mentioned with policies and procedures, this does not have to be a super complicated document, but a defined written strategy helps the organization to optimize the use of its capacity and its resources. The plan should reflect the size and scope of your organization, and I've seen a few cases where the organization has this super robust, large plan, and it's like a half-time executive director that they have. They don't have any other staff, and I thought to myself, that is like more than a full-time person's salary, or not salary, time to execute. So the plan should reflect the size and scope of your organization. So you'd expect to see a smaller plan for a smaller organization and larger, more robust and comprehensive plan for a big one. Okay, if we're not having fun yet, we're starting to get into the real fun of code of conduct and ethics. This is a core document of the organization. A code of conduct and ethics is an internal guideline and an external statement of how the organization values, what its values and commitments are. It defines the behaviors that are and are not acceptable from the organization stakeholders. BC Soccer's Code of Conduct and Ethics describes the principles of good governing behavior, has language about integrity of sport and general statements about conduct. Then it describes specific statements that apply to the association's officials, team officials, players, match officials, and spectators and parents. That covers everybody. It also includes specific language about harassment and discrimination and communication in social media. These statements establish the criteria for what constitutes a code of conduct violation so that organization stakeholders understand and know what is expected of them and what might happen if they do not uphold the code. A code of conduct to protect children is something that's a little bit newer to our consciousness. And so the code of conduct speaks to the conduct more generally. A code of conduct to protect children is more specific in that it describes the guidelines for appropriate and inappropriate conduct between those of the age of majority and those who are not. As well, it defines what to do if you witness inappropriate conduct, and it defines that suspicion of child abuse will be reported to law enforcement. And in case you are not aware, this is law, and it must be done regardless of whether it's in your policy or not. So that's just a heads up. A code of conduct to protect children is meant to provide an environment that supports participants' physical and emotional safety. Other important documents. There are many other policies, really. There's too many to detail. Other policies that sport organizations might include a member policy, including a policy about traveling and participant safety when traveling. It is increasingly common and in the soccer world, basically mandatory to have a judicial code. It's essential to have formal complaints, discipline, dispute resolution, and appeals policies to handle code of conduct and other violations. It's becoming more and more common to have a policy that addresses equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. And it may include trans participation, diverse gender policies, religious headwear, etc. A conflict of interest policy is a good choice. It defines what an actual conflict is, as well as a perceived conflict, what those would be, the process to disclose conflicts, and how to file conflict of interest complaints, among other things. A privacy and confidentiality policy would also detail what is considered private and confidential information to your organization and how private and confidential information is handled within your organization. In that case, you would look to your governing legislation in your province and in Canada for that. A volunteer management policy is recommended, especially around volunteer screening with specific language around criminal record checks. And finally, your organization would have a variety of safety policies, including Rule of Two, Respect in Sport, which Alfonso mentioned earlier, supporting of Coaching Association of Canada's Responsible Coaching Movement, concussion and injury management, weather, equipment safety, emergency action plans, etc. There are a multitude of other policies out there as well, and your organization should discuss what's most relevant to you before you implement. Okay, so we've now got through our operational policies. Let's talk about the documents that you would use for reporting. And when I say reporting, I mean how to share the progress of the organization through a variety of mechanisms on a variety of topics. The first document that you would use to report is the annual report. This report is issued annually ahead of the organization's annual general meeting and gives an overview of the achievements of the organization over the past year. It should describe the process. the progress of the organization on its strategic goals. And generally, it should also include the year's financial statements. Although I have seen instances where that isn't in the actual plan or report, it goes alongside with. The annual report traditionally includes an address from the president or chair, the executive director, if there is one, and reports from the organization's committees. It might acknowledge partners, stakeholders, volunteers. It might include registration data, and it would likely include photos from programming or awards to make it pretty. As I mentioned, the financial reports would accompany the annual report and are prepared each year. There are three different reports: an income statement or a statement of operations, a balance sheet, also called a statement of financial position, and a statement of cash flow. These statements should be prepared by a qualified accountant and should be accompanied with some analysis or commentary by the club treasurer or the executive director. Now, this next report is it is an internal document. So the management report would be issued to the board of directors from the executive director in advance of standard board meetings. Such a report should include updated progress towards implementation of the club's annual operational plan, and by extension, its strategic plan, if it has one. A management report should also report on any other performance measures that the board requires to properly evaluate club performance. It should include comments on anything that relates to the risk of the organization, which this is essential for the board to know, and note things of note that will come up prior to the next meeting. This document should contain the necessary detail to keep the board informed, but it shouldn't be overly in-depth, and it's helpful to keep it consistent in layout and content for ease of reference and comparison. The technical report accompanies the management report, or maybe a segment within that management report. It describes the progress on performance goals in relation to players, teams, and coaches, or growth in technical capacity. It would describe the progress on the technical plan, and it would likely include some commentary from the technical director or the head coach with respect to technical program execution, program planning for the future, and budget management. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't spend at least a few minutes discussing risk management. In the webinar, Board Leadership and Management, I spoke that one of the board's responsibilities is to safeguard the assets by regularly assessing risk. Risk management is the practice of identifying, assessing, and treating risks that hinder organizational operations and jeopardize resources. A risk registry, then, is a comprehensive list that identifies and ranks the risks, determines the likelihood and severity of those risks, and then captures current strategies to manage, mitigate, absorb, or avoid risk, as well as potential additional solutions. As an example, a risk may be that your organization is hacked. All of your financial information has been stolen, participant information has been leaked, and your IT system is down. And as a matter of fact, this happened to a client of mine last week, and they are a provincial association and everything is down. They have no files, their emails did not work. It's all gone. They're piecing it back together. You would identify the risk and then consider how likely this risk is to occur, which is probably unlikely, and what the severity of the impacts would be if the risk were to occur, which is probably severe impacts. Then you can decide how to handle the risk. Will you implement increased security? Will you change passwords regularly? Do you pay for stronger insurance or cyber insurance? And could you prepare an action list to execute so that you're ready to react if needed? A registry would be a tool for both the board and the staff and should be monitored and updated regularly at a time that works for you. Maybe that's every quarter, maybe that's twice a year, maybe that's once a year. Many of the risks identified in the risk registry would be managed or responded to by many of the documents we discussed today. And the reporting would be one of the methods to monitor risk. A risk registry is a lot of work. I'm actually going through it with the board that I sit on right now. It's a lot of work, and it's going to take several meetings over the course of a few months for us to put the list together and to finalize it. And then that's not even the management, but it's something that we feel that we need to do. And it's arguably not that fun to discuss all the things that potentially could go wrong for your organization, but it allows an organization to be proactive instead of reactive and back on your heels. So this is exactly what we're using as an example. There you can see. I would like to share some final comments about monitoring and review. All policies should be regularly monitored and reviewed, and done so meaningfully. It shouldn't be done just to check the box, but ensure that your organization is operating optimally. You also want to be careful not to over-prescript with language and to strike the balance where you share enough language that people can understand what you mean, but leave your staff and volunteers capable to think constructively and interpret effectively and to apply the process appropriately. Finally, it should always be the goal to write language in policy as accessibly as possible. Many of our participants and our stakeholders in soccer speak English as a second or even a third or fourth language. We have to aim to be inclusive and to write policies so that youth can understand our policies, and adults as well. It's one way that we can work to be inclusive in our organizations. So reconsider the legalese of documents and consider if there's a way to structure your policy even more simply.